Have you ever looked at the person you've loved for most of your adult life and realized they were already saying goodbye long before they ever spoke the words? I used to think marriages ended because of one terrible mistake, an affair, a betrayal, a lie too big to forgive. I know better now. Sometimes a marriage ends because one person slowly forgets who stood beside them before anyone else believed they would become someone worth admiring. The day my husband became a millionaire should have been the happiest day of our lives. Instead, it became the day I lost everything I thought we'd built together. My name is Emma. I'm 48 years old, and for 24 years, I believed my husband and I were building one dream together. I just didn't realize that somewhere along the way, Michael had started imagining that dream without me in it. When people hear our story, they usually assume I ignored the warning signs. The truth is, I saw them. I simply found a reasonable explanation for every single one. Love has a strange way of making excuses before it accepts reality. When Michael and I met, we had absolutely nothing. Our first apartment was so small that if one of us opened the oven door, the other had to step aside just to walk through the kitchen. The heating barely worked during the winter. The air conditioner barely worked during the summer. The refrigerator made a noise every few hours that sounded like it was preparing for its final breath. Looking back, it should have been miserable. Instead, it felt like home. Every Friday night, we'd stop at the same little grocery store on the corner. We'd buy a frozen pizza, a cheap bottle of wine, and one chocolate bar that we promised to share equally. Michael always ate more than half. I always pretended not to notice. Back then, life wasn't about what we owned. It was about what we believed was possible. Michael had one dream that never changed. He wanted to build a software company, not just another business. He wanted to create something meaningful, something people would remember. His confidence amazed me because almost no one else shared it. His parents encouraged him to find a secure office job with health insurance and a retirement plan. My father once called his business idea an expensive hobby. Even some of our friends quietly wondered how long I would continue supporting a husband who worked 16-hour days without bringing home a steady paycheck. But I never doubted him. Not once. People sometimes ask whether I sacrificed too much for Michael's dream. Maybe I did. But that's the thing about love. When you're building a future with someone, sacrifice doesn't feel like sacrifice. It feels like an investment in a life you hope to share. I worked 2 jobs for nearly 5 years. During the day, I answered phones at a medical office. 3 evenings a week, I served tables at a family restaurant just outside town. There were nights when my feet hurt so badly that I cried in the shower because I didn't want Michael to see how exhausted I was. He was already carrying enough guilt. I didn't want him carrying mine too. Sometimes I'd come home after 10 at night and find him asleep at his desk, still wearing his glasses, surrounded by empty coffee cups and pages filled with handwritten ideas. I'd gently remove his glasses so they wouldn't leave marks on his face. I'd cover him with the blanket his grandmother had knitted years earlier. Then I'd kiss his forehead before quietly going to bed. Those moments never felt extraordinary while I was living them. Now they're the memories I miss the most. People often think success is built during the exciting moments. It isn't. It's built in the ordinary ones. The mornings when you wake up tired but keep going anyway. The evenings when you're terrified about paying next month's bills but still manage to laugh together over burned pasta. The weekends spent repairing an old washing machine because buying a new one simply isn't an option. Those years shaped us. Or at least, they shaped me. Slowly, things began to change. Michael landed his first major client. Then another. He hired one employee. A year later, there were 8.by the time the company celebrated its 10th anniversary. More than 100 people worked there. For the first time in our marriage, I stopped checking our bank account before buying groceries. We replaced our old pickup truck. We bought a beautiful house with a wide front porch. We even adopted the golden retriever we'd written about years earlier in a notebook we called Our Life Someday. I still remember the afternoon we started that notebook. It was raining outside. The roof leaked into a bucket sitting in the hallway. We were sitting on the living room floor because we couldn't afford a proper dining table yet. Michael grabbed an old spiral notebook and wrote 4 words across the front. Our life someday. Inside, we filled page after page with dreams that felt impossibly far away. Buy a house with a garden. Take Michael's mother to see the Pacific Ocean. Visit Italy. Never argue about money again. Grow old together. Some dreams were practical. Some were silly. One page simply said, "Learn how to dance before we're too old to embarrass ourselves." I laughed so hard I could barely write. That notebook became our little tradition. Whenever life felt difficult, we'd add another dream. Whenever we achieved one, we'd place a tiny check mark beside it. It reminded us that even slow progress was still progress. Years later, after we'd moved into our beautiful new home, I found that notebook while organizing a closet. I spent nearly an hour reading every page. There were little coffee stains, bent corners, notes written in different colored pens from different stages of our lives. It felt like reading the story of two young people who believed they could survive anything as long as they stayed together. That evening, I showed it to Michael. I expected him to smile the way he used to. Instead, he glanced at it for barely a second. He smiled politely, said it was a nice memory, then checked his phone before walking into his office. I stood there holding the notebook, telling myself not to overthink it. He was busy. The company was preparing for something huge. Important meetings, important investors, important decisions. Looking back now, that was probably the first time I realized I had become one of the least important parts of his day, not because he stopped loving me all at once, but because success had quietly begun demanding more of him than I ever could. At first, the changes were so small they barely seemed worth mentioning. He started traveling more often. Business dinners became almost a nightly routine. Weekend meetings suddenly couldn't be postponed. He bought tailored suits instead of the comfortable sweaters he'd worn for years. His old friends slowly disappeared from our lives. In their place came people I'd never met before. People who talked about private jets, investment portfolios, luxury resorts, and exclusive golf clubs. Whenever I joined them for dinner, I felt strangely invisible. No one asked about my work anymore. And no one cared about the years before the success. It was as if our real lives had been erased the moment money entered the picture. Michael seemed comfortable in that new world. I tried to be. I really did. But every time I walked into one of those elegant restaurants, I found myself missing Friday nights with frozen pizza and one chocolate bar we could never quite split evenly. Because back then, I never questioned whether I belonged beside my husband. Now, for the first time in 24 years, I wasn't so sure. There was one thing about Michael that had always made me feel safe. And no matter how busy he became, he used to tell me everything. Every failed meeting, every exciting opportunity, every client who said yes, every investor who walked away. We never had secrets. At least, not the kind that mattered. Somewhere along the way, that changed. It didn't happen after one argument. There wasn't a dramatic moment when he suddenly became distant. Instead, silence slowly took the place of conversations. Whenever I asked how his day had gone, his answer became shorter. Busy. Fine. Just work. That was all. The man who once spent an hour telling me about a single software update now couldn't find 2 minutes to explain how his week had been. I told myself he was exhausted. Building a company from the ground up came with responsibilities I couldn't fully understand. So I stopped asking as many questions. That, I think, was my first mistake. Not because I should have interrogated him, but because I slowly convinced myself that loneliness was simply another part of being married to someone successful. One Saturday morning, I suggested we drive to the lake where we'd celebrated our first wedding anniversary. It had become a tradition over the years. Nothing extravagant, just sandwiches, coffee in travel mugs, and a long walk along the shore. Michael barely looked up from his laptop. I can't, he said. I have people flying in from San Francisco. I smiled. Maybe next weekend. He nodded without actually answering. Next weekend never came. Neither did the weekend after that. A few months later, I stopped making plans altogether. It hurt less that way. Then came the invitations. Charity galas. Corporate events. Award ceremonies. Michael wanted me beside him, but not in the way he once had, years earlier. He had introduced me with pride. This is my wife, Emma. None of this would have happened without her. I used to blush every time he said it. Now, introductions sounded different. This is Emma. Nothing more. No warmth. No story. No acknowledgement of the years we'd spent building that success together. At first, I wondered if I was imagining it. Then I noticed something else. He had started changing the way he dressed, the way he spoke, even the way he laughed. His old jokes disappeared. His old habits disappeared. The man who used to wear worn-out sneakers to weekend barbecues suddenly cared about designer watches and tailored jackets. One evening, while he was getting ready for another business dinner, I stood in the doorway watching him adjust his tie. You look nice, I said. He smiled at his reflection, not at me. These people notice details. Something about that sentence stayed with me. These people? Not we. Not us. Just these people. For the first time, I realized there was a part of Michael's life where I no longer belonged. A week later, I found the old notebook again. I wasn't looking for it. I was searching for Christmas decorations. When it slipped out of a storage box and landed at my feet, I smiled as I brushed the dust off the cover. Our life someday. I sat on the floor and began turning the pages. Almost every dream had a checkmark beside it. House with a backyard. Golden retriever. Financial security. Take mom to the Pacific Ocean. Travel to Italy. Near the end of the notebook, one page caught my attention. It simply read, promise each other that no amount of success will ever become more important than coming home. I stared at those words for a long time. I couldn't remember writing them. Maybe Michael had. Maybe I had. Maybe we'd written them together. Either way, we'd broken that promise. I closed the notebook and placed it back inside the box for reasons I couldn't explain. I suddenly felt like I was mourning something that hadn't officially ended yet. Looking back now, I think my heart understood the truth long before my mind was willing to accept it. Then came the announcement. Michael's company was being acquired. I still remember the excitement in his voice when he told me. It was the happiest I'd seen him in months. The deal had taken nearly a year to negotiate. Lawyers, investors, board meetings, endless paperwork. When everything was finally signed, the numbers were almost impossible to comprehend. The media called it one of the biggest technology acquisitions of the year. Friends kept sending congratulatory messages. Former co-workers I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly remembered my phone number. Everyone assumed I must have been celebrating. The truth, I felt strangely uneasy, not because of the money, because I looked at my husband that week and realized he hadn't hugged me once. The celebration dinner was held at one of the most expensive restaurants in the city. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. A pianist played softly in the corner. People toasted Michael's success over glasses of champagne that probably cost more than our first month's rent. Everyone wanted a photograph with him. Everyone wanted 5 minutes of his time. I stood nearby smiling for pictures, answering congratulations, thanking people I'd never met before. For hours, I barely spoke to my own husband. Whenever our eyes met across the room, he'd smile politely before another executive pulled him into another conversation. I remember thinking, just get through tonight. Tomorrow we'll finally have time to celebrate together. I had no idea tomorrow would become the day my marriage ended. The following evening, the house felt unusually quiet. The balloons from the celebration were still sitting in the living room. A few unopened congratulatory gifts rested on the kitchen counter. Michael walked in just after 7.0, phone in his hand. No laptop. No smile. He looked strangely calm. Too calm. That's when I felt it. That tiny, almost invisible shift in the air. The kind you can't explain but somehow recognize. I asked if he wanted dinner. He quietly said no. I asked if everything was okay. Instead of answering, he walked to the dining table and slowly sat down. He looked at me for several seconds. There was no anger in his eyes. No sadness, only a kind of emotional distance I'd never seen before. In that moment, I realized something was about to happen, and for the first time in 24 years, I was afraid of what my husband was going to say. He took a slow breath before speaking. I've been thinking about this for a long time. I remember staring at the wooden grain of our dining table instead of looking at him. We'd bought that table after saving for almost a year. I used to joke that one day our grandchildren would eat Thanksgiving dinner around it. Funny how quickly ordinary objects become painful memories. I don't think we're the same people anymore, he continued. The words didn't make sense at first. I thought he was talking about retirement, about moving somewhere warmer, about finally slowing down after years of chasing success. Then he looked directly at me. I want a divorce. The room became impossibly quiet. I could hear the clock on the kitchen wall, the hum of the refrigerator, even the rain beginning to tap softly against the windows. Everything sounded louder than his voice. I waited for him to smile, to tell me it was a terrible joke. He never did. Instead, he folded his hands together as if he had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times. I've changed, Emma. I didn't answer. I've spent months trying to convince myself this feeling would go away. Still, I couldn't speak. Then came the sentence that stayed with me for months. I feel like I'm holding onto a life that doesn't belong to me anymore. I finally looked into his eyes. They weren't cruel. That almost made it worse. There was no anger, no resentment. Just certainty. 24 years together. Reduced to certainty. I wanted to remind him of everything we'd survived. The tiny apartment. The unpaid bills. The nights I worked until midnight while he chased a dream everyone else laughed at. The notebook. The promises. The golden retriever sleeping upstairs. But somehow I knew none of those memories lived inside him the way they still lived inside me. When did you stop loving me? I whispered. He didn't answer immediately. I don't know if I stopped loving you. Those words hurt more than if he'd simply said yes. I just don't think I belong in this life anymore. No, that wasn't true. He belonged in that life. He simply believed he deserved a different one. I packed one suitcase that night. Not because he asked me to leave, because I couldn't bear sleeping beside someone who had already left me in his heart. Before closing the bedroom door for the last time, I glanced toward the bookshelf. The old notebook sat exactly where I'd left it. I reached for it almost without thinking. It was the only thing I took that had no financial value. Everything else I left behind. The first few weeks after the divorce felt unreal. People tell you to stay busy. Go outside. Keep moving. As if grief can be outrun. It can't. Grief follows you into grocery stores. It sits beside you in traffic. It climbs into bed with you at night. I rented a small apartment across town. The furniture didn't match. The walls were bare. For the first time in almost 25 years, there was only one coffee mug sitting beside the sink. That sight broke my heart more than I expected. Some mornings I reached for my phone to tell Michael something funny before remembering there was no longer a reason to call. I started seeing a therapist. At first, I hated every appointment. Talking about pain somehow made it feel more real. But little by little, I stopped talking only about losing my marriage. I started talking about myself. Who was Emma without Michael? It was a question I hadn't asked in decades. I found a position managing the front office of a small nonprofit organization. The salary wasn't remarkable, but every evening I came home feeling useful, needed, seen. Slowly, life became quieter. Not happier. Just lighter. I began taking long walks every Saturday morning. I joined a neighborhood book club after one of my coworkers insisted I needed to meet people. I laughed again. The first time it happened, I actually surprised myself. It wasn't forced. It wasn't polite. It was real. One evening I realized something extraordinary. An entire day had passed without thinking about my divorce. That frightened me. Then it comforted me. Healing doesn't announce itself. It arrives so quietly that you almost miss it. About 5 months later, I heard through mutual friends that Michael had stepped away from the company. Apparently, retirement wasn't what he'd imagined. Some of the people who had surrounded him after the acquisition had disappeared almost as quickly as they'd arrived. I didn't ask questions. It no longer felt like my place. Then someone mentioned Claire, the young woman everyone assumed would become part of his glamorous new life. She had left too. Again. I felt nothing. Not satisfaction. Not revenge. Only sadness for two people who had mistaken excitement for happiness. Exactly 6 months after our divorce, someone knocked on my apartment door. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, Michael was standing there. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked older, not because of gray hair, because regret has a way of aging people faster than time ever could. He looked around my apartment before meeting my eyes. I've been trying to find the right words. I quietly waited. I don't think they exist. Neither did I. I thought success would make me feel complete. He laughed softly. It only showed me what I'd already thrown away. For the first time since I'd met him, Michael cried. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just silent tears from a man who had finally run out of excuses. I was chasing a version of myself that never really existed. He said, I kept thinking I'd become someone new, and somewhere along the way, I forgot the person who loved me before I was anyone. I believed he meant every word. That was the tragedy. His regret was real, but so was my healing. He asked if we could try again. 6 months earlier, I would have done anything to hear those words. Now, they arrived too late. I invited him inside. We sat at my tiny kitchen table. I made 2 cups of coffee. For a while, neither of us drank them. Then I stood, walked to the bookshelf, and brought back the old spiral notebook. Our Life Someday. I placed it between us. Michael rested his hand on the cover. I haven't seen this in years. I know. We turned the pages together. The little apartment. The backyard. The dog. The ocean, Italy, every dream with its tiny checkmark. Then we reached the final page. The one that simply read, Grow old together. There was no checkmark beside it. Michael closed the notebook. I'm sorry. I know. I'd give everything to go back. I smiled sadly. I believe you. He looked relieved for a second. Then I continued. But the woman who would have gone back doesn't exist anymore. Silence filled the room. Not an angry silence. A peaceful one. I reached into the drawer beside the table and pulled out a brand new notebook. The cover was plain. Cream-colored. Empty. I opened the first page. Michael watched without speaking. Slowly, I wrote 2 words. My life. I closed the notebook gently. I spent 24 years helping us build a dream, I said quietly. And I don't regret a single one of them. I looked at him one last time. But now, it's finally my turn to build one for myself. Michael nodded. He understood. Maybe for the first time in a very long time. When he left, I stood by the window until his car disappeared at the end of the street. Then I walked onto my small balcony with a cup of coffee. The evening air was cool. Somewhere nearby, children were laughing. A dog barked in the distance. Life was moving forward. Not because everything had worked out the way I'd once imagined, but because I had finally learned something that took me nearly 50 years to understand. Sometimes the greatest love story you'll ever experience is the one that begins the moment you stop waiting for someone else to choose you and finally choose yourself.